the prince said, as he stood before Gavinaugh, ready to mount his steed. "I am but one, my lord, and I ache to reach all of Arrethtrae. I worry that my legs might not endure, and the days of my life might not be numerous enough to reach them all. Where do I start?" He looked upon the royal face of the prince. The prince smiled. "You start and end with me, Gavinaugh. You are responsible for your service to me, not for the decisions of others. Fulfill your duty one day at a time, and leave the outcome in my hands." Gavinaugh understood and nodded. "Your fellow knights do not trust you. Your journey to the ends of the kingdom must first pass through Chessington. They need to know that you are truly a knight of the prince." "Yes, my lord, but how am I to travel?" The prince held up his hand to silence him. Gavinaugh knew that the prince could hear something he could not. He strained to listen. A moment later, he not only heard the rumble, but felt the pounding in the earth of hundreds of horses. Out of the north, he saw the growing mass of a mighty army approaching. He felt a swell of anxiety in his stomach and began to draw his sword. "They are mine," the prince said as he mounted his steed. He looked down at Gavinaugh, and in that moment Gavinaugh felt the gaze of a king upon him. Soon an army of mighty warriors enveloped them. They saluted the prince and waited in silence for his command. The prince's horse reared, and he led the force southward to the great sea. As the massive steeds and their riders passed by on each side, Gavinaugh recognized one warrior among them. Poranth broke off from the rest and came to him. "You look well, my friend," Poranth smiled as he spoke above the thundering sound. The last of the warriors passed like a rush of wind, and the sound of beating hooves quickly diminished. "I am well. Finally, I am well," Gavinaugh returned the smile. Poranth nodded. "You have partaken of the character of the prince. It is easy to tell when one has been with him." "I am humbly grateful and a privileged man." "As are we all." Poranth looked toward his retreating force. "May your travels be fair, and your battles sure, Sir Gavinaugh." "And yours, good sir," Gavinaugh said. "You don't perhaps have an extra horse about you, do you?" "Strange you should ask," Poranth said. "You are not the only one who has skirted death." He smiled again and bolted away toward his army without another word. Gavinaugh was confused, but he was learning that the messages of the silent warriors were oftentimes more like riddles. He watched the prince's army diminish in the distance. "I guess my travels will begin on foot," he said aloud, and looked toward the forest from which he'd come weeks earlier. Just then, a horse neighed loudly a short distance behind him, and Gavinaugh nearly jumped out of his armor. He turned to see a sight that delighted his soul. Triumph? He ran to the horse and could hardly contain his joy. "Triumph! It is you! How could this possibly be?" Triumph seemed pleased to see Gavinaugh as well. He stroked the horse's neck and felt as though they were once again a team. In examining the horse, he noticed the scar on Triumph's shoulder, but otherwise he seemed healthy and whole. He mounted Triumph and looked forward to his course back home. After many days of travelling, Gavinaugh arrived in the Chessington Valley. He timed his arrival at dusk, for he was unsure of the status of the city and of the noble knights. He knew he must face Caiaphas one day, but now was not the time, for such an encounter would only hinder his call to the greater purpose of life. He took the back alleyways to the home of a man named Tarl. He dismounted and knocked quietly at the back door, as he had done many times before. The door opened slightly, and a stout-looking man with a scraggy beard peered out.
"What the—"
The man opened the door to allow Gavinaugh entrance, and then looked outside after him to confirm that no one was watching. He quickly closed and locked the door, and turned to face Gavinaugh. This was no joyous reunion.
"I heard you were dead, or worse,"
Tarl said bluntly. Gavinaugh did not respond. He produced a small bag that jingled with coins. "Where do they meet now?" Tarl laughed.
"So you've come to finish the job you started, eh? I guess I know